Yeah, I mean, one is don't be afraid. See, when you feel anxious, it does feel very bad. It's not a pleasant feeling. So that the sort of default reaction to it, especially if you're a seeker, and if you're seeking, you're more sensitive to these things. But when you feel anxious, a reaction is often, I don't want to feel this way. Let me try and get rid of this anxiety. Now, if you're Brahman, you're not the body mind. That means it's okay for the body mind to feel anxious. So there's one half of it, one part of this which is worth exploring is like, actually, it's okay for the body mind to freak out, to have a total freak out, you know, to have a complete meltdown. And when you're triggered in this way, like, you know, when it comes to things like not getting enough food or potentially not being able to feed yourself, that's a big thing, right? The body and mind might kick into overdrive. Huge amount of adrenaline might be released, stress hormones. Mind might start thinking. You might feel jittery, on edge. All these fears might come into your mind, catastrophizing, thinking of worst case scenarios, yeah? Now, a part of this is physiological. A part of this is actually useful for the body. When you feel stressed and anxious, like you haven't got enough, you might not be able to feed yourself. Your body's response to that is to start thinking of all these different worst case scenarios. That feels horrible. It doesn't feel good. But there is a use to it from a survival point of view, because you can actually come up with lots of solutions if you're worrying that you wouldn't have come up with if you're doing this, yeah? And without any thoughts. So don't be afraid of the worry. Don't be afraid of the anxiety, and recognize there might be positive aspects to it as well as negative aspects to it. And because you are Brahman, even though you might not feel like Brahman, you are Brahman irrespective of what is being felt. So you can allow that mind to do this and go worrying, and it might generate solutions for you. Don't be attached to it. Just see it as, you know, like if it's I don't know, I'm trying to think of an example. If the wind's blowing really strongly, it might blow one of those sort of wind turbines around really quickly, right? And that's just what happens when it's really windy. The wind turbine goes around really quickly, yeah. And that's like when it's a stressful situation, the mind kicks in and starts thinking, and the body starts feeling tense and anxious, all this kind of stuff. Just see it as a cause and effect. That's just what the body mind does when it's mortally threatened, or, you know, some psychologically threatened, or threatened in some kind of way. And don't worry about it too much. Just explore it. That's one aspect of it. We don't have to quash these vasanas altogether. You will also learn about things that way. So we don't have to suppress. On the other hand, if you're becoming very neurotic, and it's more than just like a helpful worrying reaction that doesn't feel good, it's actually pathological. It's actually, you know, stopping you being able to do things, function, or, you know, it's actually worse than what it should be or what you're able to do with it. Then you can use the yogas to try and suppress that negativity, suppress the neurotic aspect of it. Now, as I said before, the practices are on the level of the body and mind. Or often I talk about the body, the voice, and the mind. There are 3 levels of practice: the level of the body, level of the voice, and level of the mind. And the most subtle type of practice is on the level of the mind. So if your vasanas are very weak, Aham Brahmasmi works really nicely. Yeah? But when it becomes stronger vasana, Aham Brahmasmi doesn't really work very well. Which is why Jnana Yoga, the intellectual style yoga, is usually better for sort of middle class people who have got all sorts of income. They're not worried about their, you know, survival. You know, they've basically got food and shelter, and they've got middle class problems, you know, what we call first world problems, right? These are the sorts of types that, in general, again, massive generalization, they're attracted to the jnana path. Yeah? They've got few subtle vasanas. And if they've got deeper vasanas, they're not being triggered because their life isn't triggering that. They've got food, they've got shelter. But then when you start having your life, threatened in some way, then you need these deeper practices. So next course level is the voice. It's chanting mantras. They're more powerful than Aham Brahmasmi in the mind, in the sense that they're coarser. They can, just like a hammer is coarser than a pair of tweezers. Yeah, tweezers are much better for that fine work, to get rid of fine particles. But if you want to hit a wall down or something, you need a hammer or a sledgehammer. Yeah, so that's like the voice. It's a much coarser instrument. And then you've got the physical practices in the body, like your hatha yoga practices, your breathing practices, these sorts of things. And that's like a bulldozer. You got your tweezers, your hammer, and your bulldozer. And they're all good at different things. Yeah, you wouldn't use one for the other. So if in most of your life you're fine, you can just use your tweezers. When there's a bit of dust in the mirror, you just remove it with some tweezers. But when your stronger vasanas come along, we need to learn different techniques. And one of the most powerful ones is devotion and faith. And often life batters you around and knocks you around until you develop some faith. And usually you won't develop faith until life's battered you around and knocked you around a bit, because you're going to need to. And then when you have faith, you see, and especially if you feel love towards some God or guru, then you can use all these three levels of practice: body, voice, and mind. You can use them all directed towards your God or guru. So you can bow, which is a physical practice. You can chant, which is a verbal practice. You can think of and you can picture the God guru, which is a visual, which is a mental practice. You see, all the practices. You can dance, you can sing, you can do all levels of the practice can be then a form of bhakti, form of devotion. But again, Jimmy, it's going to be you finding that yoga that works for you. And you'll tend to know which one works for you. You'll tend to know when you're feeling anxious, what do I need to do? Ramana wrote a poem called Upadesa Saram. Upadesa, it means teaching. And Saram means the essence of the teaching. And in the first few verses, he takes you through the structure of these three levels of teaching and stuff. There's a version on my website. If you type in Upadesa Saram, Ramana Tom Das, you'll find it. And I've put a bit of commentary there just because it's very, very concise verses. So you might not spot the connections necessarily. But I've written a very brief commentary after each verse just to explain to you how that works and just give you some ideas. And then it ends up with the sort of most subtle and highest form of teaching, which is self-inquiry. And it goes into self-inquiry eventually. Verse 4 talks about those three levels of body, speech, and mind. I actually knew about these three levels prior to reading this poetic work of Ramana's, because in Buddhism they talk about these three levels as well. You'll often, if you are interested in Buddhist teachers, they often talk about the human being as consisting of body, speech, and mind, which I always thought was a very weird way of talking about the human being. I thought, what are you talking about? Why are you talking about body, speech, and mind? It's such a weird way to talk about that's what the human body is composed of. And from a sort of medical point of view, it is a strange way. And why this emphasis on speech? But it's because from a practical point of view, in terms of teachings and practices and spiritual practice, that makes sense, because these are the primary ways which we engage with spirituality, through our body, through our voices, and through our minds. So in that sense, it works perfectly.